Hi, I'm Brad Alexander, and today I'm presenting a paper called Genetic Improvement of OLC and H3 with Magpie. OLC and H3 are spatial libraries from Google and Uber, respectively. Magpie is a state-of-the-art genetic improvement library. The theme of today's talk is getting more out of Magpie and GI libraries in general to make sure that evolution goes as smoothly and fast as it can. The authors of today's paper are Bill Langdon from UCL and also me, Brad Alexander from Optomatics and also the University of Adelaide. Now, the motivation of today's talk is fairly straightforward. Genetic improvement has been shown to work, and it's been really effective in fixing bugs, porting code, improving speed, reducing memory consumption and reducing energy consumption, a range of other applications. It's a very practical technology. It produces real results, and they're verifiable by people, and they can be, these changes have been deployed in real software and real software development processes and improvement processes. One drawback to date has been, and it's common to a lot of researchers, a lot of this work has used bespoke tooling, which means that it's been hard to sort of set up and it's hard to transfer results and generalize to other settings. So to address this problem, a number of frameworks have been produced to make GI easier. There are some examples. So there's GIN by David White, now maintained by Justina Pecky and Alexander Brownlee. And that is a flexible GI framework and a very extensible GI framework for Java applications, still in active use. More historically, there's Piggy and Piggy 2, and that's a Python tool for GI targeting multiple languages. And leading on from Piggy is a state-of-the-art tool, Magpie, by Amrik Blott. And the Magpie framework is a modular, very flexible GI framework targeting multiple languages, and it can also target software development at multiple levels. We'll see a little bit more of that later. These tools are widely available, and they are getting better. But what is really needed is not just the tools, but a deeper body of practice in using and improving them, because quite often it's not just the tools, but it's also the idioms that people develop and the tricks that people develop to make them as effective as possible. And that's really the focus of today's talk. So this work is really the first use of Magpie and industrial source code. So Google's open location coding and Uber's, and I'll see if I can get this right, hierarchical hexagonal spatial indexing. And the idea is, the thing that we've done is improve program performance by changing C source code. We changed the tooling in Magpie for running and measuring program performance. And that was a sort of key aspect of this work. And the speed up that we got is better than previous work, very similar work targeting the LLVM intermediate representation. The C code that we're targeting is the improvements that we've got are better than that. So a little bit about Magpie. Here is the meaning of the acronym: Machine Automated General Performance Improvement via Evolution of Software. And it was developed from Piggy 2, and it separates search, the search framework from operations. Now, this is a very powerful idea, and you've seen it in things like strategic rewriting systems as well, where you have a separate search strategy, and then you have the local operations for applying them. In our case, the search strategy we use is simple. It's local search because it's proven to be effective and it's easy to apply. So we simply look greedily at local improvements and then latch onto them when we're searching for software patches. Now, the operations that we employ can be different in different domains. And so in the case of Magpie, it's quite rich. It can target things like compiler optimization options, runtime configurations, and in our case, which is most relevant to us, is actually source code improvement for genetic improvement. Now, a little bit about the target applications. So Google's open location coding and Uber's H3 essentially do a similar thing in terms of converting longitude and latitude coordinates or other specifications of coordinates, but in this case, we're testing longitude and latitude to essentially geocodes. So these are nice structured strings that specify a particular location on the planet. They both work on prefix notation. So you might start off with the general location of the UK, for instance, might all be in a box that's labeled 9C. This is for the Google open location code. And so the 9C will be the prefix of all of these things, and then the suffixes sort of narrow you down to a different square coordinate and so on. And with this, with a fairly short code, maybe 16 bytes, for instance, which is what we use in this work, you can get down to the location of a small block or a bunch of houses or a large building. So you can really, really narrow down to quite tight code, quite tight locations with a fairly short string. And for Uber, whereas OLC does a grid on a rectangular map, Uber uses hexagonal coordinates, a little bit more complex, but still uses these hierarchies of hexagons to locate coordinates. Now, these applications they both do similar things, but they have different code sizes. So OLC, it's based on a grid. At its core, it has 14,000 lines in total, but the core transformation of longitude and latitude to code, once you take the comments and blanks out, it's 134 lines. H3, because it's working with hexagons and has more complex coding, as a result, starts off bigger, and once it's reduced down to its bare minimum with comments and blanks removed, the search space is 1,615 lines. So 134 lines of search space for OLC, 1615, an order magnitude more for H3. So we want to improve the performance of both of these applications in converting longitude and latitude coordinates to geospatial coordinates. And so we do the setup to do GI on source code. This is C source code. And we're going to use GI per line operators. And these operators include line deletion, line insertion, and line replacement. So really, really simple setup. We optimize for execution speed, but of course we still need to maintain correctness. And the applied tests, we apply 10 test cases during evolution. And of course we have holdouts that we apply to make sure that that's correct. Now the runtime is chosen, the runtime for each of the optimizations is chosen just to ensure coverage. So we look at essentially a coupon collection argument where we try to assess how many evaluations or how many mutations we would need to ensure that every line has been touched at least once, but at least with high probability. And so that means that we have a lot longer runtime for H3 than we do for OLC, because H3 is a lot larger. And we use, as I mentioned before, we use hill climbing for search, not because it's fundamentally powerful, but because it's been shown to work in the past and it keeps things very simple. Now, a key to the success of this work, a key to making this work practical, I should say, is reducing noise. So noise can really slow down evolution by providing false signals or requiring you to do lots and lots of trials to get a rough approximation of the modified runtime of an individual variant. So, so what we need to do is adapt our measurements to take account of the noise distribution. So looking at the noise distribution, this diagram here is the noise distribution for the classic triangle program. And it sort of demonstrates how noisy wall clock time is. So what you see here is that these sort of red points here, these are the runtime of the first trials on these particular test cases. So, so you can see here that for these test cases here, the first trials take quite a while as the whole test harness and all the software around it warms up, they have longer runtimes. And then what you find is that the batches increase, you get more reliable and less noisy runtimes on each of the test cases. But what really stands out here is that if you're just using some of these averages of walk-off times, it's going to be really difficult to actually detect differences between these runtimes. You could say, oh, the runtime of the test case is this, and there'd be no way that you could easily map that to a particular test case. And we know that these test cases actually have different numbers of instructions in them, so that's pointing to a real problem. So so walk-off time is quite noisy and prone to where you are. Is heavily dependent on the run order of the sample, you know, when you ran that particular sample, when you ran that particular test. And if we look at the OLC test cases, we sort of get a sort of similar distribution. So we have all these 10 test cases, and what we do is we get this really skewed distribution where most of them take very little time, but then there's these outliers quite often just during the warm-up phase. But basically you get this one-sided distribution. The runtime won't go below a certain minimum. Okay, it won't. It's bounded from this side, but on the other side, in terms of having long runs, it's got this long tail. And again, when you just look at this wall clock time, we can't distinguish test cases using runtime. And again, that indicates a bit of a problem, because we know these test cases will execute different lines of code. So we know that different numbers of lines of code. So we know that they should take, or detectably different times. If we switch from using wall clock time to instruction counts, then we end up with a lot less noise. So if we use state-of-the-art performance counters, so in this case, in this work, we use perf count HW instructions, we get less noise, and as a result, we need less samples. So this is what happens when we do instruction counters using perf. So we can actually see that the runtimes for tests are clustered, as you'd expect, you know, because these tests use different numbers of instructions. And you can see that they're very, very narrowly defined. Some of them, the lines are so close together, we just use a symbol to denote it, because you couldn't actually see the separate lines. But you can see here that when we switch to something less noisy like a perf count, then we're in a lot better shape. In fact, we're able to get away with just using 3 samples per test case for each of these test cases, and then just sample the lowest quartile of each test. Now, there's a bunch of other tricks that we used, partly in response to the sort of initial issues with wall clock time. We ran more warm-up evaluations on null patches to get a baseline for improvement. But of course, that also helps in reducing the impact of noise, especially on those first warm-ups. We wrote a test harness for measuring instruction counts purely in C. So the idea is that the measurement of the time that it took to run the program is purely in C code. And of course, then we have a sort of lightweight call from the PyTest framework inside of Magpie, using Python's C types interface, which allowed us to make the call to the test harness in C. And in the same spirit, the output was directed from the test harness to a buffer provided by Python. We needed to get this output in order to check that it was correct. So this is the sort of key result. So we tested and evolved on both OLC and H3 variants. And we wanted to see the performance on both the with respect to both the optimized and unoptimized code. So we ran with and without the GNU compiler 03 flag on. What we saw were good speedups for both applications in all settings. And the interesting thing is that all the best of all mutants passed all holdout tests, and there were 10,000 of these. So very, very robust code as the result. So just going through the table, for OLC, these are the results for OLC. spread across 4 files. The lines of code with and without blank lines and comments you can see here. The size of the patches and the minified versions of the patches which are sort of reduced by Magpie. Magpie's got a good minify function, so we can use that to reduce the size of the patches. And we're getting speed ups on the plain code. So when we run on each mutant just the plain GNU compiler without the O3 flag, then we get speed ups of 3.6. And we get less speed up, as you might expect, with the O3 flag on, because you'd expect that some of the optimizations that you get are going to already be captured by the O3 compiler. Not all of them, but at least some of them. And so you'd expect to see that it would be harder to beat. The actual run times on OLC are very, very fast. So 82 seconds on a laptop for the plain compiler, and 95 for the O3. As you'd expect, this 95 is a bit larger than the 82 because it takes time to run the optimization in O3. And we're seeing a similar pattern of results for H3. For the unoptimized version of the code, 15% improvements, which is better than we've seen before by a fair degree, and also 7% here. The runtime's a lot longer because we need to get that coverage of the code. So the runtime is a lot larger, but they're both producing good results in reasonable time. Just looking at pass rates, surprisingly, and this might be a result of the nature of this code, we're seeing that OLC, that we're getting a lot of tests passed for each variant. So these are the variants during optimization, and we can see that for both OLC and H3, most variants are actually passing the test. We're getting some to fail to compile. This orange failing a test includes cases where things run for too long, and we use the standard sort of sandboxing that is provided by Magpie to prevent things from taking up too many resources. Another aspect of the result is just to see the trajectory of runtime. So this is for H3, and this is the number of patches generated. And so you can see here that, of course, because it's hill climbing, you're going to get, well, we'd expect to get different results just depending on the trajectory of search. But you can see here that the amount of noise is still significant compared to the improvements, but it is at least small enough to allow us to detect significant improvements. And so you can see that for each of these runs, even though we get different trajectories, we can still see that there is a steady improvement, and there hasn't even reached the end of improvements in even most of them. You can see here that there's still some late breaking improvements in these runs. So this is a promising result. And again, this is just local search. This is not anything which is more powerful than that. Just looking at the code produced, the examples are basically, I would say they're pretty close or related to specialization. So it's things like removing a redundant normalization and checks. We're dealing with correct longitude and latitudes. We're not dealing with another input representation, so there's no need to normalize them. So those checks were removed. We also remove code that supports code paths that aren't executed in the particular test cases that we have. So in a sense, it is making sure that the code that is executed is a better fit for the test cases that we're using. So sort of just to conclude, what we found is that Magpie is easy, and you can look at the code for this. This is something that we can provide. Magpie is easy to use and to modify. The changes that we made aren't that detailed. They're actually fairly simple to set up, and it's actually fairly easy to get it run. It's very quick to get this change version running, or these experiments running. We were able to get useful and robust improvements. The measures to reduce the noise were really key to getting this to work. And in future work, I mean, things like a richer set of mutations and crossover, all including crossover, would be good. So to move beyond hill climbing, it'd be interesting to co-evolve the training data to challenge it. Now, the results that we evolved actually work really well on holdout data, but as we start to get into more challenging problems, that might not be the case. So co-evolution of training data so we can adversarially drive testing would be really good. And of course, using profiling to focus search more deeply as applications get bigger. So the credits are, of course, a credit to Americ for producing Magpie, Wiesetoff for producing NuPlot, and this work was funded by Meta OOPS project, by the Meta OOPS project. And our contacts are here, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.